well. So the kids that played video games and the laparoscopic surgeons performed equally well on these specific hand-eye coordination tasks. Now, it's not to say that the kids can be laparoscopic surgeons, no, of course not. But it just shows that by playing video games, you hone those skills, those hand-eye coordination skills. And there's many examples of doing so. So any questions so far? So for those that don't play video games, is that convincing enough to start playing video games? No, maybe not. Okay. So now we move into serious games. And it's basic. I mean, there's a lot of definitions here, and I'm not going to get into the definitions, but just think of them as video games whose primary purpose is education instead of entertainment. And I know there's debate about this term and what have you, okay? But it's basically using games and video game-based technology to, for education and learning purposes and training purposes. And the first likely serious game was Battlezone. It was a game released by Atari in 1980. And it was actually modified. A modified version of it was used by the U.S. Army to train tank gunners. They were actually using it to train tank gunners. I don't think it went too well, but nonetheless, the U.S. Army from 1980 has been using video games to train. They've realized that there's value to it. Unlike many others in the educational field, areas and what have you, the U.S. Army realized that there's a lot of value in using games to train. It engages people and they're interactive and what have you. So right now, what I'll do is wrap up. I talked about simulation, talked about playing games, and talked about serious games. So if we look at, and again, I won't go into the theory here, but every serious game is itself a game. Every game is a simulation. So we've been using simulation for thousands of years. We've been playing games for thousands of years. Why not use games to train? And that's really the whole kind of, I hope that comes across here. It's nothing new. Games for training is really nothing new when you consider that games, we've been playing games thousands of years. Simulation, we've been using it for, why not use games to train? Okay? And that's really the kind of, where I'm going to focus on now. Okay? The use of games and immersive tech, adding immersive tech to the mix. And I'm going to focus on medical education. But just again, because most of you are students here, think of opportunities. Serious gaming is actually a growing area. And there's all kinds of estimates. It's been estimated to be a $2 to $10 billion global market. But the key is that it's growing. And by growing, it means that people with your skills that are graduating from computer science and engineering and electrical engineering and that type of thing, you guys have good opportunities. And it's a growing area, so there's going to be a lot of jobs. In 2014, the United States institutional market for pre-K-12 education, software and content in total was $8.38 billion. That's not only serious games, of course. It's just in general using interactive software for education and training. So it's a big market and it's growing. In Canada, the serious gaming companies are very small, but there's some really big players in the U.S. and the U.S. really dominates the market in terms of serious gaming. For the most part. Breakaway Games, for example, they've done a lot of work for the U.S. military, and they continue to do a lot of serious gaming work for the military, and they get, they're funded with millions of dollars. In March of 2015, Ubisoft, you guys know who Ubisoft is? Big French gaming company. They have a big presence in Canada. And what was really, so they announced in 2015 Big Rush, and that was basically, it was a serious game. So it was the first serious game by one of the big players, or at least Canadian companies in Canada. They're a French company. And it was to treat amblyopia. Okay, so you're getting these big players now that are realizing, hey, it's not just about entertainment. There's another big market that has a lot of potential and opportunity. So the other thing too, again, for people with your skills, CAE, big simulator company, they're a Canadian company, And they make all the flight simulators for Boeing, for Airbus, and they do a lot of simulation work. They've had openings, I haven't checked recently, but a few months ago, a couple years ago, they had openings for game designers, for multimedia developers. Again, people with skills such as what you have. There's real good opportunities. These guys are a big company, and you would never think, I mean, big, been around for decades. They make simulators, real serious stuff, and they're looking for game designers. And why are they looking for game designers? Because game designers and game developers currently, they have the skills to create these virtual simulations. They use, they have good math skills, they use all the appropriate tools, they have good computer graphics background, they use Unity, Unreal, for example. They have the skills that are needed to create these virtual sims. And that's what's really driving a lot of the simulation area, virtual. So yeah, a lot of good reasons. I talked about the, why use simulation, virtual simulations in serious gaming. In medicine, sim labs where you have these mannequins, these real, life-size mannequins and very realistic mannequins, they're extremely expensive. Those mannequins can cost over $100,000. And creating a lab to house these, you're talking about millions of dollars. You need space, you need the resort, the equipment. You need people to take care of the labs, monitor the labs. These are very expensive and they're limited. So we're not saying get rid of these labs, by no means. You still need those labs. What we're saying is perhaps we can prepare the students to go into the lab so that when they're in the lab, which is limited resources and limited time, they make the best use of it. So how do you prepare them to go into the lab? You use virtual tools and serious gaming. Okay? And that's really, in Canada, that's where a lot of the focus is placed on. Using these virtual tools, so you kind of have this scaffolded learning approach, where you have, novice residents, they'll train on these virtual sims and with serious games. They're better prepared to go into the lab. When they go into the lab, they make better use of the lab in the limited time they have in there. Okay. Now, one of the things that, if we look at serious gaming, for the most part, a lot of the emphasis is currently placed on, and virtual sims in general, on cognitive skills training. So by cognitive, I mean, the procedures, steps and tools required to complete a procedure. Technical is still very limited because to mimic or to simulate the technical aspects of, medical procedures, for example, you need expensive equipment, haptic devices, and those haptic devices, or at least to get high fidelity that's needed for medicine, they're very expensive. So we're still fairly limited. But cost is coming down with the emerging, like VR and all this good stuff that's coming out. A lot of that stuff is coming down. So again, the price is coming down. So again, more opportunities for students like you, okay, to do some really cool stuff with, Arduinos and all kinds of things like that. And I'll show some examples there. Now, this brings me to, so any questions so far? No? Yeah?
Is there any gap between reality and virtual reality?
So what do you mean by, so there's definitely some things that we can't do still. So there's definitely a gap in that sense. We can't recreate reality perfectly. And if you look at a lot of the sims, the medical sims, you run into if you try to replicate reality very faithfully, depending on what you're doing, I mean, you can create an environment and make it very realistic. But when you start getting into the, the nitty gritty, like, cutting with a scalpel and having the blood flow, that becomes very difficult to simulate. And what you can get into is, you can kind of get into an effect that can actually be very bad, because all of a sudden you have this very realistic, operating theater and environment and, cool machinery, and we can do that. And then you start cutting and you realize it doesn't quite flow right, or something's not right. And then that can just break your whole suspension of disbelief, and then you know that you're not, you know that it's fake, for example. So there's a lot of interesting questions there, and there's still a lot of technical things that we can't do, that we're limited with. But again, things are changing so fast that it's becoming better and better. And then the other question about reality is, how much reality do we actually need? And that's kind of an open question too. Do you really need all these, faithful graphics and what have you? And the answer to that seems to be not always. It depends on the learner and on the task at hand. So what level of the learner is. So there's definitely gaps. There's technological gaps, and there's also gaps even with respect to teaching methods. Like how do you actually, depending on what level you are and what the task is, and find the right level of fidelity. So definitely gaps. But gaps are good because that means jobs for you guys, right? Problems for you guys to work on. And in Canada, I know that this is a really big area. Yep.
Is there any seated games using augmented reality?
Yep. A lot of it, and in medicine too. There's actually a group in Florida, and I can't remember their names, but they're doing a lot of medical-based training with augmented reality. And the nice thing about that is that you can, with augmented reality, you're looking at, you get the real and the virtual combined. And so now imagine you're looking at a cadaver, for example. Imagine an anatomy class where you're looking at a cadaver and you're looking at it through, your augmented reality headset. If you're a novice trainee, all of a sudden, very simply, you can put labels on body parts. You can label them and provide. So absolutely, they're doing that, and you can get into far more difficult. So if you have to cut, if you're going to do some form of cutting, for example, you can. If you're new or more of a novice or intermediate learner, you can perhaps guide the user as they're cutting through the virtual body part or the real body part, things like that. Okay? So yeah, absolutely. And augmented reality, in my opinion, I think augmented reality is where things are going to really become, it's more augmented reality than, or be bigger than virtual reality, I think.
A large class of those applications of serious games utilizes essentially the actual world. Basic games is a very large class that has a lot of applications. For example, fighting fights or fighting flats or whatever you want. And this, it may reduce the need for big virtual reality, but you need the augmented reality part.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think augmented is where things are definitely going to. And there's some interesting articles on that effect too. And then even if you're looking at large classes, it's not to say that this is perfect, because even with large classes, then equipment becomes an issue, and so it's not. There's issues even with this stuff too. Of course, equipment is still, you can buy an HTC Vive for about $1,200, but you can buy one with $1,200. It becomes expensive. Or a Microsoft HoloLens is several $1,000s still. So there's still issues. It's not by no means there's problems, but as time goes by and as the technology improves, the costs become less, and that becomes less of a problem. And then, how do you actually, if you have a class with 200 students, how do you immerse them all? There's logistical issues too. So this moves into any other questions? Okay. So immersive tech. So when we're talking about immersive technology, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I don't know how much time I have. Oh, okay. So I'll move through the immersive tech fairly quickly. But when we're talking about immersive technology, I think it's fairly clear. We're talking about technology that blurs the line between the physical world and the digital or simulated world. And it creates this sense of immersion. And I usually don't like Wikipedia, but I like this definition, so I wrote it down. And the key really is immersion. The sensation of being in an environment. So you you're creating this sense of being somewhere else. Now, it could be purely in your head, but nonetheless, you're creating this sense of being somewhere else. Now, the best example of immersion, of being caught up in this suspension of disbelief, where you kind of ignore everything else around you, it's not even virtual reality. It's a book. Who reads a book? Not an e-book, a real book. Even an e-book. Well, what happens when you read a good novel and you just can't put it down? Has that happened to anyone? Good. Okay, a lot of you. That's a perfect example of being immersed. You kind of forget about everything else and you kind of put yourself into that story, so to speak. And I think that's a great example. Movies, the same thing. You can be immersed in movies and comic books and what have you. I used the Da Vinci Code because that was the last book, I think, the last novel I read many years ago. And I couldn't put it down. I mean, I read it, I just couldn't put it down. And that's a great example of immersion. Now, the key with immersive tech, we're hearing a lot about it, and this whole craze right now with virtual reality and augmented reality. But again, it's nothing new. Back in 1956, the Sensorama was released, and it was basically a single person. You're, kind of in this contraption over here. You're looking at this monitor, and you're holding onto these, grips, and you perceive a pre-recorded experience of, I think it was a motorcycle ride, if I'm not mistaken, and you have fans blowing air on you, so you kind of, now the graphics, it was a video, I mean, it was, it wasn't great fidelity or very, I mean, it was realistic because it was video, but nonetheless, nothing new, so, over 50, 60 years. But what has happened as technology has improved, I mean, this is this whole, big contraption over here. As technology has improved, things become faster and they become smaller. Ultimately, computing is computing, but it's become faster and smaller. And over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been huge advancement in the areas of computing devices. Cell phones are a perfect example. And then we talked about the remote and the Wii, the Nintendo Wii. The Kinect, the Microsoft Kinect, you have the Leap Motion and things like that. So this is really creating a lot of opportunities for you guys, again, because you can do some really cool stuff. There's been some really, bright things that have come out of, people have come up with some really good uses for this. Like the Microsoft Kinect, which is able to detect motions in 3D space. In Toronto, at one of the hospitals in Toronto, there was a very simple project, a good project, I don't mean to say that it's simple but good, where they hooked up a Kinect in the operating room, and they had surgeons that wanted to go through X-rays. Rather than pressing buttons on a keyboard, or some button of some sort, they would just move their hand, make this particular motion, and they'd slide through all the X-rays. So that's an example of gaming technology, pure gaming technology, applied to a real world for a very good cause, and it made life easier for the surgeon in the operating room. Current buzz, virtual reality, augmented reality, and it really started with stereoscopic 3D TVs and Avatar, the film, a number of years ago. Continued with the Oculus, and there was a great buzz when Facebook purchased Oculus for $2 billion. And now you have HTC Vive. Anyone here use the HTC Vive? What do you guys? Yeah. What do you guys think of the HTC Vive?
It seems like the Oculus Rift, the new one, the same thing, but you have more controls. You feel that you're really inside the VR.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. I felt like I get motion sickness, so I couldn't use the Oculus. And then I put on the Vive, and I thought, wow, this is really good. Like, it's really good. I was really impressed with it. And again, with the Vive, you're able to stand and move around. So you're interacting. The interaction, it's far better than the older version of Oculus, right? So that's, but we're able to do some really cool stuff. Microsoft HoloLens, and I have the main driver here is games, or at least it was games, but that's really changing. Games, I don't know if games are going to be the main driver of VR, and there's some debate on that. But a big area of VR and immersive tech is going to be medicine or medical education and health and well-being. And if you look at games, the problem with putting on these headsets, you become very solitary. Okay, and until we come up with a way where we can interact, I don't know how big of the gaming market there's going to be. Okay, so unless there's some way to really interact with people, it's very solitary. But with training, these tools are actually creating some good opportunities for training. And in medicine, there's a number of areas where this is very important. Teaching medical professionals, but also educating patients as well. There's a big area in that. Here's the Oculus. I'll go through that. HTC Vive. The HoloLens. And now everything, it looks like the emphasis is on viewing, and everything. You have these displays, and obviously that's a big component, being able to project in stereoscopic 3D. But it's not the only thing. There's haptics and simulating the sense of touch. That's an area, a growing area as well, where there's a lot of opportunities for you guys with your skills. Right now, haptic rendering is very limited. Or at least if you want good haptic rendering, it's very expensive. And there's a limited number of efficient and affordable haptic devices to the general public. There hardly isn't. There isn't any. There's a few gaming devices that are cool. You can do some cool things with them, but they're fairly low fidelity. Novit Falcon is one. This one here is actually pretty good. The Geomagic Sculpt, it's about $1,000, and you can get some pretty cool. You can do some good things with it. So yeah, again, as I talked about, gaming, but it's, that with immersive tech, that divide between, and VR, really that line between games and virtual reality is really, it has eroded. Games, VR, it's all pretty well the same. Because if you look at VR, what are they using to develop VR applications? They're using gaming engines and gaming tools. So it's pretty well, it's one. Okay? And again, when you're dealing with virtual reality and virtual simulations for training and for military training or medical training, it's really gaming. You're using game design and game development tools and techniques. So, okay, I'll briefly show some of the stuff that, just give you an example of, this was done with the HTC Vive, and this was a virtual sim developed to train anesthesiologist residents on the epidural procedure, so what they have to do to prepare for giving the epidural procedure. They weren't actually giving the epidural procedure, but they were going through the steps required, washing hands, that type of thing. So I'll just show you that. This was done with the Vive. And this we did with a number of doctors, or with 2 anesthesiologists at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Canada. So we actually ran a study with this with anesthesiologists, anesthesiology residents, and we've in the process of writing that. So that operating room, it was done, it's a fairly good representation of an actual operating room at Sunnybrook. It's modeled fairly faithfully, in terms of dimensions and the equipment and what have you. So yeah, just give you a feel of what that looks like. So yeah, you go through the whole procedure. I'm not going to show the whole thing. But nonetheless, one of the other things, patient education, this is with a cardiologist, again, at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And what he's really interested in, the nice thing about, you get a lot of medical people in Canada anyways, and they're really excited about technology. And they actually approached me, and I was talking to Katarina earlier about one of the anesthesiologists that I showed, that I worked with on the previous project. He actually came to me when I gave a talk, and he said, Bill, I want to talk to you. I bought this Oculus Rift, and I want to do something with it. So, the guy's not a tech person, but he bought the Oculus Rift, and he came to talk to me about using it. So, they're very passionate and very excited about tech, which is really cool to see. This is with a cardiologist at St. Michael's Hospital, and he was really interested in patient education. So he was interested in educating patients going into a catheterization lab to do an angiogram procedure. And the whole theory behind this is if you educate the patient on what they're going to go through, what to expect, and on aftercare, patient care is better. And it makes the task of the doctors better too, obviously. So just so again, they're going through. Basically, they're in the. This is the view that they're going to see from the headset, left eye, right and they're going through the procedure of what's going to, what the patient will expect as they're going through the angiogram procedure. Now, this was a fourth-year project that was done by a group of students, and the one student is continuing on, and he's going to do this as his master's work. So he's going to create this framework that's going to allow customization of the environment and the procedures and what have you. Now, the nice thing about it is that this is driven by, a medical professional, and there's a want, the medical folks and the medical professionals want this stuff. So the kids now or the students that are actually, doing their masters, and it's very rewarding for them to actually work on this stuff and do things that will potentially, do a lot of good to the general public. So it's actually really cool, and the students are very motivated to work on these projects. Some other work looking at using the Vive to look at the eye fundus exam, or examination of the eye. I don't have a video for this, but nonetheless, we're just mimicking an ophthalmoscope and looking at the eye, looking at the structure of the eye. And human anatomy education. This is where augmented reality can play a really big role. And we've done some work in this domain using tablets, a big display, or ideally a tabletop display where you display, for example, the body. In this case, it's the eye. And then you can have individual trainees with their own smartphones or tablets, and they can go in and look at a customized view of the body that's displayed on the main table. And you can have, again, for novice trainees, you can present them with, label the parts, just in a very simple manner. And for more complex or for more advanced trainees, you can remove that information and create these different scenarios. Yeah, this was actually work. We hacked up that table. You can see the 3D markers, and we did that very quickly. That was a project in Japan that we worked with some colleagues in Japan. And I was able to bring a couple of students to Japan, and we did this all in 1 week. We rigged this up in 1 week, and that was kind of the, come to Japan, but you got to do this for 1 week. And it was kind of cool. This was work done with, this was a few years ago, but I like to, this was done with some orthopedic surgeons at Mount Sinai. And one of the problems they had, they would, their trainees, the orthopedic, the residents, the very beginner residents, they would come into the operating room to look at a knee replacement. We're looking at knee replacement here. And they were given, textbooks to read about the procedure. And what the surgeons were finding, or the trainers were finding, was that the residents were ill prepared. They weren't just reading the material. They were coming into the operating room and they weren't prepared. And that wastes time. And time accounts for money, obviously, but it's also patient care. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to waste time in the operating room. So what they approached myself, and we wanted to go through the steps and the tools required for each step. There's about 100-something steps in knee replacement surgery, full knee replacement. So we went through and we created this sim of that. And again, it's just to go through the steps and the tools required in each step. And so we actually ran some studies with it, and we did find that for novice trainees, it's effective. Whoops. So again, this is going back a number of years ago, and it was, it was really interesting where, working with the, obviously when you're working as an engineer, working with, the content experts, the game itself, or the sim, is driven by the content, right? I mean, you have to abide by the content. So you have, when you're working in these interdisciplinary teams, it's very important to understand the language of each other, right? And to know that, you have to let them know that there's limitations, there's things we can't do. Like when we were going through this game, we had a list of, we want this, and we want it done, next week. And, my thing was, well, you might get this and you might get that, and it'll be done in a year. So, just expectations, and even language. One of the, I won't go through that again. One of the student that actually worked on this, he had a little video, and I might show it later. And he was like, he talked about what it's like to work with the doctors, and he said they went in and they made it clear he's not going to talk tech to them if they don't speak Greek to him. So that was kind of funny, the doctor speaking Greek to him. So again, with this game, with the knee game, currently what we're doing is we're adding the drilling process to it. So we're adding actual technical skills, and we're focusing on drilling. There's a lot of drilling that happens when you're going and replacing a knee. And what we're doing is, rather than use a high-end haptic device, we're using a low-end haptic device, which is limited fidelity, but we're trying to compensate for that low fidelity with sound. So can we use, or we're investigating whether we can use sound to increase the haptic fidelity perception that the user has. So that would allow us to use a low-end haptic device in place of a high-end one, potentially. And that goes into this whole area of, I forgot the name. Perceptual-based rendering. Okay, so, kind of exploiting, perceptual effects. And there's a whole bunch of things we're doing here. I'm not going to go into that. And we've done a little study that looked at that. We did a drilling task, and we used sound. And we did find that sound can, in fact, influence our perception of haptic fidelity. Keep in mind, though, that with sound, and I've done a lot of work on that with respect to graphics, but it's also very subjective. So my notion of good music, for example, may be different from yours, right? So sound is very subjective. Some other things here too, oscillation training. And this one here, I like this project. This was done a few years ago, and it was using the Kinect. And this was a fourth-year project. And it's basically using the Kinect to, this was done with a rehab doctor who, he actually invented a device, a physical device for shoulder rehabilitation, and it mimicked rowing. So what we did was we took the device and we basically used that as our main game mechanic. The movements of the device were mapped to the game. So basically those swinging motions move into, or are mapped to gameplay. And show. So you get this again. So yeah, and then there's more. I mean, but basically because we're running out, I think. Just from the start, there was this quest for high graphical realism. And if you go back to the games in the 90s, 80s, it was all about graphics, graphics, graphics. Now, that's actually very good because what did it do? Well, it created all the computing power that we have are directly a result of gaming. And this high quest, this ever, more and more greater and higher fidelity graphics. But then, as I pointed out, the Nintendo Wii came along and it really blew that out. All of a sudden, graphics wasn't the focus; it was more interaction and the user. So, in terms of how much realism or fidelity is needed, it's an open question, as I pointed out earlier to one of the questions. It depends on the level of the learner and on the task at hand. You don't necessarily need expensive graphics. And I was, a few months ago, I was in Colombia, and I looked at their simulation center. And what they do to train their laparoscopic surgeons is they have this little box to mimic the body. And they have their, the tools that the laparoscopic surgeons use. And what they have them do is go in and peel a grate with their, forceps and their devices. And they were peeling a grate. Low fidelity, but it does the job, right? So you don't need necessarily these high fidelity graphics. It depends on the task at hand. And then of course, the other thing too to keep in mind is that, as a computer scientist or as engineers yourselves, it's very easy to say, I'm going to develop a game for, training or to teach math, just as an example. But there's far more to it than that. You have to really consider the design, and you have to also consider that you're not an expert necessarily in math or the content. and you have to rely on the content experts. Okay? So you have to work in a team. And it's very important to do the background. And by background, I mean the design. You have to really do your needs and task analysis. You have to look at your audience. You have to look at what the use is. There's a lot of design that goes into these things. And if you don't do that design and you don't consider who your audience is, whatever, the whole thing, you're going to come up with a product that's not going to be effective. And you don't want that. So instructional design, most important step, your needs and task analysis. It really is, you have to look at what is the objectives, what is the purpose of this game that you're doing. And of course, interdisciplinary development team. With medicine, you're dealing with medical professionals, educational experts, artists, the techies, the engineers, the scientists. And that can lead to problems because sometimes it's different language. But